So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final keynote. It's usually at the end of the day, you say something like you've saved the best for last, but I feel like we've had a whole day full of bests. So we have our final set of bests here with a keynote on artificial intelligence and the new Jim Code, Professors Ruha Benjamin and Meredith Broussard. And with that, I'm going to turn over the floor to both of you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Charlton, and thank you, everybody, for coming today. This has been a really stimulating, intellectually stimulating day. So it is my great pleasure to be here today with Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, and a new book called Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, which you should get because it is amazing. It is available for pre-order now and is coming out in early June. She is also editor of a new book called Captivating Technology, Race, Carcereal Technoscience, and Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life, which comes out this week. And so it is my great pleasure to be on stage with Ruha.
Awesome, great. And I get to introduce Professor Broussard, but I have to say as I introduce her that unfortunately her book is already dated. I would love to do a plug, but unfortunately she's now an associate professor of journalism at NYU. So we need a Naomi Wolf moment and recall the book. So Professor Broussard is a data journalist at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute of NYU and author of Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. Her research focuses on AI and investigative reporting with a particular interest in using data analysis for social good. A former features editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, she's also worked as a software developer at A&T Bell Labs and MIT Media Lab. And so with that, I'll get us started with the first question. One of the things that's really striking about artificial unintelligence is this balance between tech enthusiasm and tech skepticism. There's a line that I love, many in the book, that you have this balance. And so you say, as a car, the Tesla is amazing. As an autonomous vehicle, I am skeptical. And so tell us a bit about how you balance this together, someone who writes codes, but who's also critically engaged with this entire tech industry, how that works together for you in your analysis.
Well, so I actually opened the book with a story related to this. I opened it with a story about a time when I was little and I tried to build a robot. And I had this robot building kit and it had a little motor and I plugged it in and it didn't work. And so this was my introduction to the fact that we can build things with technology and what we imagine the technology is going to do is not necessarily the same as what the technology actually does. So there's a really big gap between our imagination and reality. And so I took this knowledge into my work as a developer because often I would write code and I would imagine that the code could do something, but then once I implemented it, it couldn't actually live up to my expectations. So this is something that we really need to confront as people who make technology, is we need to not get out over our own skis. And so I think in the case of autonomous vehicles, which I write a lot about in the book because I think this is a really important technological issue as well as a social justice issue, the makers of autonomous vehicles are really invested in the fantasy of autonomous cars, and they're not giving enough attention to the often disappointing realities of them. And so it is absolutely possible to keep building technology in the face of constant disappointment. I mean, this is actually how you build code. Like you have to be okay with constant failure, basically, because nothing ever works the first time that you build it, and you have to kind of bang your head against the wall, and then it feels really amazing once you stop. But this gap between imagination and reality is something that we really need to be more honest with ourselves about when we're thinking about technology and society. So, Ruha, I want to ask you about your work. So your sociological work focuses on science, medicine, and technology. And so how did you come to this interest, and how did these fields intersect?
So the short answer, the kind of personal answer, is that when someone tells me not to do something, it makes me just want to do it. And so when it comes to all of the things that sociologists study, I found when I was an undergrad that there was a kind of black box, an exceptionalism around science and technology that didn't necessarily pertain to other fields. And so whereas someone studying economics or politics, people don't stop them and say, well, were you a politician before this? Or were you an economist? So the assumption is that you can have some kind of access to this arena without being someone trained in that arena, which we don't grant to science and technology. And so I was interested in that exceptionalism and breaking through that, sort of piercing that bubble. And then within that, as I moved further into the social studies of science and technology, I found there were lots of people doing it. But oftentimes the way that that kind of research arena was framed was looking at the social impacts of science and technology. So the science and technology was a given, and then we wanted to study how it was impacting different communities. And I became really interested in the social inputs of science and technology. That is the way that our social order, our assumptions, norms, and biases are embedded in those things that we take for granted. And so widening the narrative, not starting with the science and technology as a given, as inevitable, and then studying how it impacts society, but looking upstream at how society actually shapes what technology that we're taught is then inevitable.
You know, this idea of inevitability, I think, is really interesting. One of the really exciting things about reading your new book was realizing that we were talking about so many of the same things, and we were like, I wish we had been in conversation. I wish we had had this conversation like 3 years ago.
I know. But I will say something about the book is that I do see both of our books and this field, the books as provocations, as conversation starters, not trying to close up or sort of tie a nice bow around it. So in some ways, I'm glad that it's sparking a conversation after the fact.
Very much so, very much so. And this feeling of inevitability, I think, is really interesting because my sense is that people feel disempowered in the face of technology. There's been this narrative that tech is something that we have to sit back and let it happen to us, that we don't have agency in deciding what are the technologies that get developed or what are the interventions or the invasions in our lives.
And I think there's two sides to that techno-determinism. One is a kind of fatalistic technology is going to destroy us, devour us. But then the other side of that, which is also techno-deterministic, is that it's going to save us. So whether we're thinking of technology as saving or slaying us, both are deterministic ways of thinking that robs us of our agency. And so just thinking about the crafting of your own book, one of the things that I love is the way that you bring together critical analysis with storytelling. There was a panel or two ago where a lot of the conversation was about the role of storytelling in both reinforcing certain kinds of hierarchies and inevitabilities, but also as a tool for subverting them. And so I just wanted you to take us behind the scenes in terms of how you think about storytelling in the crafting of this analysis.
Oh, I get to talk about literary craft. This is very exciting. So I come from a literary school called immersion journalism, which derives from the new journalism of the 1960s and is heavily influenced by the sociological practice of participant observation. So as an immersion journalist, you immerse yourself in a world in order to show your readers what that world is like. And so I do a kind of immersion journalism for technology, where as a data and computational journalist, I write code in order to commit acts of investigative journalism, and often I'll build code in order to demonstrate something about how technology works or how particular technological interventions work. So in a couple of episodes in the book, I build campaign finance software to try and fix the campaign finance system, which, P.S., is really broken and it didn't work. I also built artificial intelligence software to try and fix a particular problem in Philadelphia's public schools. Public schools in Philadelphia did not have enough books for the students to learn the material that was on the state-mandated standardized tests. And nobody had ever asked the question before of, do the schools have enough books? And so I tried to answer that question, but I couldn't because the software to answer that question didn't exist. And you can't actually do the calculation in your head because it's just like too hideously complicated. And so the process of building that technology was really illuminating in understanding the role of data in that system, and then also understanding why it's so hard for kids to succeed inside resource-starved school districts. And so it's not really a data problem, it's a people problem. And so by building technology and talking about how I built the technology was a way of accessing kind of larger social issues around what are we doing to kids in public schools.
And one of the stories that you tell, you kind of hinted to a few minutes ago, took place in 2007. This kind of harrowing story of you riding in a driverless car. And so one of the stories that we tell about tech is just give it time, right? We'll fix the bugs. And so it's been 12-ish years. Where are we with that? And would you say that we're at a place that it's reliable and safe enough for wide use?
Not even vaguely. So in 2007, I first rode in a driverless car and it almost killed me. And it was in an empty parking lot with no traffic, okay? And so the technology has come a long way since then, but it has not come as far as the marketers would like you to believe. And so next time you hear somebody saying, oh, driverless cars are definitely about 5 years away, think about how many times you've heard that and how long people have been saying that they're 5 years away, because they've been saying it actually since at least the early 90s. And so they're not actually 5 years away. They do not work as well as you imagine. And in fact, one of the things that I've become increasingly worried about with driverless cars comes from something you allude to in your book, which is the inability of systems to see darker skin. So image recognition systems, facial recognition systems, object detection systems, they don't see, well, first of all, they don't see the way that a human being does. But the other thing is that they don't detect people with darker skin as well as they detect people with lighter skin. And so the systems that are embedded in these 2-ton killing machines are not detecting people with darker skin. And I would pose the question, who exactly do we think is going to be killed by self-driving cars out on the street? And so you go into this a little bit when you talk about the racist soap dispenser. Are you all familiar with the online video, the viral video of the racist soap dispenser? Yeah. There's a man with light skin who puts his hand under the soap dispenser, a man with darker skin who puts his hand under the soap dispenser, and it doesn't work. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how this artifact functions in your work?
Sure. One of the things that I try to do in that section is bring together something that seems kind of trivial. In fact, the people who are displaying this on YouTube, they're kind of giggling through the clip, if you recall. And so it seems kind of like, it's funny, it's entertaining, doesn't seem that consequential when you just read it as a glitch of one particular technology. But we also have to think about how we got to that point. What are the larger structural aspects of the research and development process that would make it such that would happen? And those same context clues are also operating behind much more consequential kinds of technologies that are making life and death decisions about people, whether it's the risk scores that we heard about earlier in terms of whether to parole someone or not, whether it's decisions in healthcare or education, or whether someone should get a loan that they really need. And so the same type of questions about how algorithms, or in this case automated systems, are developing, who they're seeing or not seeing making are a set of questions that I think we can apply beyond any particular type of technology. And at the same time, I do think making distinctions are important. So I'm juggling the attempt to make important distinctions. So rather than just talk about racist robots, which is a great headline, which is how I sort of became interested in this, is just these headlines about, oh, our automated systems are racist. To try to think about how exactly are they racist? What do we mean by racism? What form of discrimination? So we have a spectrum from technologies that are explicitly attempting to reinforce hierarchies, like they're not hiding it, right? And so we have to make some distinction on that end of the spectrum of technologies that are designed to and are reinforcing long-standing racial, caste, class, gender hierarchies, and think about them in relation to, and this is where it interests me most, technologies that are being developed to bypass bias, that are sold to us as actual fixes for human biases. And so thinking about those as a kind of technological benevolence, right? And so tech fixes that are saying, you know, we humans, we're messed up, right? The judges are racist, the prosecutors, the police, the teachers, and so here's an app for that. Here's an algorithm for that. And I think we need more attention around those things that are purportedly here to do good, to help us address inequity through a particular technology. We still have to keep one eye over here on these obviously racist robots, right? But I think we need more attention around the promised do-gooding of so much technology and the way that we turn to it in lieu of more transformative processes that I think we should be investing both imagination into and economic and other resources into.
And so the system of the way that racism is embedded in everyday technologies is, I think, what you're referring to when you call it the new Jim Code, which of course is taken from Michelle Alexander's notion of the new Jim Crow. Right. So can you unpack for us what you mean by the new Jim Code and what's going on in these systems?
Absolutely. And so this is my attempt to remind us about the histories that are embedded in technology. So by invoking this term that was first a kind of folk term that developed to name a broader and broader set of practices around white supremacy that then got resuscitated through the book, The New Jim Crow, to describe how mass incarceration has a license to legally discriminate and reinforce caste hierarchies, extending slavery, extending Jim Crow into the present. For me, the current milieu is not sort of simply the next step. It's not that we're over old school segregation, we're not over mass incarceration, but it's thinking about how techno-scientific fixes create new forms of containment and how this history is important to understanding the impact of these technologies. So it's a combination of coded inequity, often more subtle than past regimes of racial hierarchy, but also the key to the new Jim Code, really the distinction, is that it's purportedly more objective and neutral than those prior regimes. And so that's where the power and problematic of this regime takes place, is that we put our guard down because we're promised that it's more neutral and objective. And precisely when we put our guard down is when our antenna should go up in some ways to thinking critically about this. And this came up a number of times in the previous panels. And so I think there's a heightening consciousness around really being aware of anything that is promised to be more objective and neutral. And so what we see here is a whole set of practices under that umbrella.
And the notion of objectivity and neutrality and the idea that a machine could be free of bias is something that I really grappled with a lot as I was writing my book, because as a computer scientist, when you're doing math, because ultimately when you're doing computer science, you're doing math, because computers, they literally compute, which we kind of forget about, but like really, it's just a machine and it's doing math, and ultimately all of the fancy stuff we're doing with computers comes down to math. And so, when you're doing a math equation, like it's just an equation. But one of the things that I think is so interesting that has happened among the math and computer science community is they got really carried away with the idea that math was superior.
Yeah.
So this is the basis for an idea that I call Techno Chauvinism.
Yeah.
So not quite technological determinism, but Techno Chauvinism, which comes from the idea that, which is the idea that technology is superior, that technical solutions are superior to human solutions. And it derives from the idea that math is superior to, say, the humanities or the social sciences or really any other form of intellectual inquiry. And then when we look at the people who for centuries have said, oh, math is so superior, and we as mathematicians don't have to worry about pesky social issues because our work is so highfalutin and important, those people are very homogeneous looking. Yeah. And they've policed the boundaries of their profession, again, for centuries, so that women and people of color, for example, are excluded. So it's not necessarily that computer scientists are out there saying, I want to go make racist technology. Yeah. Like, I don't actually know any computer scientists who are doing that, thank God. But it's the unconscious biases of a very homogeneous group of people that end up manifesting this way. And they think, oh, it's just math, it's just computing, and it's going to be superior to all these pesky social issues, and it's not true.
And one of the things that I get from wrestling with techno-chauvinism, as you describe it, is that chauvinism isn't limited to solving all of the problems out there, but even when this kind of conversation about equity and justice is brought up, the default intervention is to look for a mathematical way to define fairness and equity. So can you say a little bit about, so I presume, and I've seen that computer scientists, data scientists are grappling now, are forced to grapple with questions of equity and fairness. How are they doing that? And what do you think about how they're sort of domesticating the critiques that we're raising here?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am so excited that there is a conversation happening around fairness and transparency and ethics in math and computer science. I think it's thrilling that the conversation is happening, and the FAT STAR conference is doing some really interesting work. One of the fundamental problems, though, is that not everything in the world can be explained mathematically. And that's okay, but that's really hard for a lot of people to hear, because they're really invested in the idea that math is superior and that mathematical solutions will just like make all the problems disappear, right? But when I think about fairness, I think about the social and mathematical definitions of fairness, or dimensions of fairness, really. So let's say you have a cookie. And when I was a kid and I had to share a cookie with my little brother, say there was only one cookie left, we would, obviously the fair thing to do is to break the cookie in half, and each kid gets 50% of the cookie. So the computer, if the computer were making a decision about fairness, it would split the cookie exactly down the middle, and each child would get 50%, and then the problem would be solved. But when you actually break a cookie, there's a big half and a little half, right? And so you have to negotiate the social issue of who gets the bigger half. And so if I told my little brother, okay, well, I want the big half of the cookie, and I want you to take the small half of the cookie, but if you take the little half, then you can pick the show that we watch on TV after dinner tonight. He'd be like, okay, that's fair, right? So we have a negotiated social definition of fairness, which works also. It's a totally reasonable transaction. So the computational and mathematical definitions of fairness don't always sync with social definitions of fairness. And so I think that if we're trying to create purely mathematical definitions of fairness in every context, we're simply going to fail, because that's not how society works.
Yeah, and this relates to one of the sort of more striking critiques that comes up again and again in the book. And this is the fact that you completely reject the idea that machines can learn. And so I love, there's moments where Meredith articulates some common sense understanding of technology, and then she just says, wrong. That's not it. I love it. It's like, doesn't involve some big, it's just wrong. And the clarity is so refreshing. But this particular idea that you say machines can't learn, so tell us how come.
Oh, this is a really interesting feature of language. So I'm really interested obviously, like I'm really interested in building code, but I'm also really interested in the nuances of language as an artist and as a writer. And I'm interested in cognition. And so when we say machine learning, it sounds like there's a little brain in the computer, because learning is something that we attribute to sentient life forms. And the term machine learning was deliberately chosen because the people making the mathematical discipline that we call machine learning are people who were really invested in science fiction and really invested in making science fiction real. And I love science fiction. I think it's really fun. But again, we have to draw a really clear line between reality and fantasy. And so the habit that people have gotten into of naming things after their favorite imaginary objects really muddies the issue. Artificial intelligence makes it sound like there's a little brain inside the computer. So one time I was giving a demo of artificial intelligence software at a kind of science fair for grown-ups. And this undergraduate came over and was talking to me, and he said, you made an AI system? And I said, yes. And he said, is it real AI? And I said, yes. And he starts looking like under the table, like as if there's some little person. And I realized he thought I meant that AI was something organic and that they had brought science fiction to life, finally. Because this is something that a lot of people are really invested in doing. But I would encourage people to just give up on the idea of general AI. Well, I mean, it's, we've tried it for a really long time and it hasn't worked. And there are much more practical ways of making something in your own image, right? Like people are invested in this idea of making like an artifact that thinks and like does what you want and, is this thing that's going to live on after you. And I feel like if you want to make something in your own image, like have a baby. It works. All right, how are we on time? Yeah, we're okay on time. So let me flip over to something about babies. You write about DNA, DNA technologies, and you connect this to eugenics. So can you tell us a little bit about the new Jim Code, about ideas, about eugenics, and how this is manifesting in today's technology?
Yeah, sure. So my previous work was around the life sciences, regenerative medicine, and I have the ongoing interest in the social dimensions of genetics and stem cell research. And so it doesn't take up much of the book, but I'm trying to make a connection between genetic technologies and the questions that scholars and analysts and activists have been asking a long time around the role of genetics in reinforcing ideas of race and racial hierarchies, and take that into now the realm of the data sciences. And one of the things that I love about the set of panels today and our ongoing conversation is people marking the fact that what we're talking about isn't all that new. There are underlying themes, concerns, fault lines, politics that are taking a slightly different iteration in the context of algorithms and computer science. But oftentimes the people who are just starting to think about it are failing to reference or draw upon this deeper body of knowledge of people who've been thinking about this from other areas. And so in one particular section here, I'm looking at the way that genetic technologies are incorporated in the carceral system and in criminal justice, and looking at the kinds of objectivity that are placed on the shoulders of genetics as this arbiter of truth, whether it's the arbiter of truth about the identity of someone, their racial group, whether it's the way in which genetic fingerprinting is used to create profiles of people based on a whole host of assumptions that actually don't hold up under scrutiny. And so it's a similar kind of phenomenon in which we're imbuing a technology with a whole host of assumptions around objectivity and neutrality, but not stopping there. We enroll it in already inequitable systems to make very important decisions that then go unquestioned because we say, well, the science says, well, the test says, without thinking about who designed that, with what assumptions, with what biases, with what data set, right, with what training data. And so genetic technologies are part of this larger suite of technologies that we're using to make really important, we're outsourcing decisions to these technologies because we think that they're more objective when we should be really concerned, in part because of this longer history and relationship between the life sciences and eugenics.
And I want to talk a little bit more about this notion of objectivity or impartiality. And I want to read all of you a really terrific passage from the book, where Ruha writes, "The danger of new Jim Code impartiality is the neglect of ongoing inequity perpetuated by colorblind designs." And as I'm reading this, I keep finding myself wanting to do air quotes. In this context, algorithms may not be just a veneer that covers historical fault lines. They also seem to be streamlining discrimination, making it easier to sift, sort, and justify why tomorrow's workforce continues to be socially stratified. Algorithmic neutrality reproduces algorithmically sustained discrimination.
And I think it's interesting. I like that you said you have this urge to put air quotes or scare quotes, because especially with respect to discussions of race, we kind of reserve our scare quotes for racial discussions when we don't do that with so many other areas that are as socially constructed and politically constructed, right? But it's this kind of urge to say, to create a distance from it. And I would say, we don't say that money that you owe me. Socially constructed, right? Yeah. That political decision. We don't use scare quotes for all these other arenas, but with race we do. And so I like that early on in one of the panels we were talking about racial realism, to say that although it's socially constructed, it's powerful in its impacts, which means we don't need scare quotes. That its reality is in the impact that it has on people's lives, to the extent that people are dying because of this reality. So we don't need to set it apart as somehow uniquely socially constructed when it's related to all these other areas. And so that is just a kind of a basic, I think, thing for us to begin questioning, to instead of creating distance, say this is part of our lived reality that we have to wrestle with.
How about we do scare quotes around algorithmic neutrality? I'd be on board with that. Yeah. Another thing that I think is really fantastic that you talk about in the book is the idea of defaults in the system and how these systems default to discrimination. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so that's my way of trying to think about business as usual. Like if we just inherit a certain process or technology or practice, and we don't do anything differently. We just follow the instructions. We just clock in or out, right? The default settings of our society is white supremacy, right? Among other things. And so just doing business as usual, you don't have to have any animus in your heart, you don't have to feel any kind of way, but just clock in or out. Do how things have always been done, and you reproduce the default, right? Which is an urge for us to actually exercise that agency we started with, exercise that kind of latent power that we're taught we don't have, and begin to question the default settings, begin to, rather than code switch to fit into existing systems, to rewrite the underlying code, the norms, the values, the discriminatory practices that we inherit. And so when we think about default, it's not just the technology that has default settings, it's actually also our social milieu that has default settings. And this is also a way for us to start setting technology apart as somehow removed from society, right? It's with us, it's part of us. And so the things that we take for granted in our everyday social interactions, those are also places that we can begin to exercise different kinds of practices that engender equity. We don't necessarily need a fix for that, a tech fix for that. So I was thinking back to the conversation about voter registration, right? And thinking about how the question the moderator asked about, maybe we could harness technology to engender greater voter registration. And there are real old school ways we can do that too, right? That doesn't involve technology, like why are we voting on a weekday? There's so many different ways in which we've structured the default setting of just voting that we could change yesterday, that could spike the number of voters, that doesn't involve new gadgets, new apps, new anything, right? And so it's a decision not to do that, right? It's a political decision not to do that. And so again, it's thinking about when we're offered I have a new thing for that, I wonder if we can just do that through other means that don't require fancy new shiny gadgets, which gets to my last question for you, which is kind of the marching orders in this book. That you say we need to actually reorient how we think of technology away from shiny new to the everyday. Why did you end up on that as the kind of final reorientation for the reader?
I really care about empowering people around technology. So often, especially in artificial intelligence, people talk about AI, but they don't truly understand what AI is and isn't. And therefore, we make ourselves susceptible to people who are telling us things that will lead us to poor decisions, right? So I really want to help people to understand how AI and how machine learning works, what artificial intelligence is. And so one of the things I do in the book is I actually demonstrate what it looks like when you do machine learning. Because most people have never seen that. Right? Like you have probably heard the term machine learning, but unless you've actually sat down and looked at what it looks like when somebody does machine learning, it still kind of feels like it's magic and it's confusing. So I want to demystify things. And I also want to, I want to go back to what you said about defaults, because that was really interesting. And I think about defaults a lot as a programmer. Because when you are writing code, you need to figure out what is your base case. You need to figure out, okay, if there's no value for a variable, what do I put in it as the default? And the easy thing to do when you're writing code about social issues is to say, okay, well, the default is just going to be what it's always been. And so then we have to think about who are the people who are writing code and what is their experience of the world. Because a lot of, say, the white men who I know who are writing code look at the world and they're like, oh, okay, it's pretty great. And so we'll just put in the default of how everything always operated. And as a black woman, I look at the world and I see racism. I see sexism. And so I'm aware that those are the defaults in the world. And so when I write code, I try to do it with an awareness of the defaults of the world. And some of those defaults, the programmatic issue hasn't been solved, right? We haven't solved racism in the real world, so there's no fix for racism in the code because the real world fixes have to come before the computational fixes, because this is not an equation. Right? It's not the Pythagorean theorem, it's racism. So it functions differently. So I felt like in order to have these intense, nuanced conversations that we need to have, we all need to be on the same page first. And so we need to understand what we're talking about. And so we need to stop having conversations where one person is talking about the robot apocalypse and another person is talking about risk assessment scores. And when we talk about artificial intelligence, we need to be talking about the same thing so that we can have a productive conversation.
And there's a There's a really beautiful sort of pedagogical strand throughout the book in which Professor Broussard, as teacher, runs through and is drawing people in to understand and demystify that will make it a wonderful addition to any classroom.
Thank you. Do people often ask you, what can we do? Because I get this question a lot, as if there's kind of one thing that that an audience can take away, or one thing that we can all go out and do, and if we just did that one thing, it would solve all the problems.
Yeah.
And I don't know, sometimes I give an answer and I'm like, this is the one thing you should do. Yeah. And then other times I kind of push back a little bit and I say, okay, well, the notion that there's just one thing that we could do is actually part of the problem, because the notion that there's one thing is actually a notion that comes from tech culture, where you boil down a problem to the pain point and then you articulate what the pain point is and then you write code against it and then it's fixed. Yeah. So do people often ask you, what can we do? And what do you say?
Yeah, I mean, my thinking around this is that we've gotten to this point through many different avenues, through top-down, through bottom-up, through horizontal. That is, every tentacle of social life reproduces inequity and injustice, which to me means that what justice and equity looks like is a challenging of every single tentacle. That is, no matter what we do, we have an opportunity to try to redress and to engage with the problem. So it's definitely not a single fix. An umbrella term that I use in the book to try to articulate a move against the new Jim Code is to think together about what abolitionist tools look like, right? And tools not simply in the techie sense, but as techniques, as practices. And so while the strand of abolitionist tools runs throughout the text, the last chapter really grapples with a range of abolitionist tools, from community-based organizations that are trying to empower communities to engage critically with all of the technologies right under our noses that shape our lives, to the role of artists that are creating all kinds of new imaginaries around both the harm and the promise of technology. Things like the white-collar early warning system that takes the idea of predictive policing and turns it on its head, and heat maps financial crimes all over the country, where we end up with, hot red on Wall Street. We're probably in a hot red zone right now. They've created an app that will ping you, warn you when you've entered a white collar crime zone, and they've averaged the likely face of a criminal using the LinkedIn profiles of 6,000 executives. And so taking that kind of idea that Derek Bell articulated about around critical race theory, and says sometimes the best way to know what we're dealing with is to reverse reality, to create a racial reversal in which you can see the absurdity of a particular reality through its opposite, right? And so in this case, we chuckle and laugh at white-collar early crime warning when those same techniques are being weaponized against Black and Latinx communities. And so you have artists, but then you also have a whole set of abolitionist techniques and tools that we don't need to lay out publicly, right? That people are using to survive digital dragnets, right? That by writing about it and exposing it, you're actually giving that information to people who can then harm, right? And so there are a whole host of abolitionist tools that we need to know are being developed. For example, there's a digital defense playbook by Our Bodies, that collective. And so here, one of the things we have to think about is what we need to survive and to thrive that doesn't necessarily need to be blasted on C-SPAN, right? The overground railroad, right? As Douglas pointed out. And so there are many things happening in locales and through organizations, individuals, that we could put under this umbrella of abolitionist tools. But for me, it was important to try to begin articulating and be in conversation with people who are seeking something more transformative than another tech fix, a solutionism, a reform that will make something more marketable, make something, more ethical in a superficial sense without challenging the underlying inequality or injustice that is killing people. And so for me, this is a concept that can be in conversation with other cousin concepts and ideas of people working to transform that larger milieu that you said need to be changed before we can see it in the code.
And I feel like one of the abolitionist tools that you use in your work is weaving in your own personal story as a jumping off point for talking about larger social issues. Is that something that's going on?
I mean, that's part of the process of undisciplining myself, right? Is, again, if we think about the feigned objectivity, the God trick, what Haraway would call the view from nowhere, in which data tells us we're sitting above it all and making judgments, then the opposite of that is to situate yourself, to show from where you look, to show why you care about things. And so in terms of our knowledge production, if what we're critiquing is the God trick, the view from nowhere, then you need to tell us where you're looking from, right? And so throughout there are some, it doesn't overpower the text, but you get to know me, because otherwise how can you evaluate my analysis if you don't know what's motivating it, right? And so this is a way that even how we write and how we talk is part of the transformation that oftentimes our disciplines do not condone.
And my favorite way that you employ this technique in the book is in the introduction, where you write about how your personal experience with police surveillance in Los Angeles influences your understanding of how technology perpetuates racism. And I feel like this is really important, because in immersion journalism, we talk about whether or not you put yourself into the work as a character. And so the rule of thumb is you don't put yourself in unless you absolutely have to be there. If you can't tell the story another way, or if your subjective experience is really meaningful to the way that you tell the story. And I felt like your subjective experience was crucial to how this story is told, to how the issues you explore are set up in the world.
And to know what she means, you'll have to get the book. Just kidding. It's just the preface. But
and it's terrific. You should definitely look for this section.
And it's an experience shared by many people of growing up in an over-policed or a heavily policed neighborhood, right? Where you grow up seeing your friends lined up against the fence on your way to school and getting patted down, of having helicopters rumbling over the roof. So this is Los Angeles. And so it's growing up with this as the normal way of thinking about what police are, and thinking about now how you don't necessarily need the audible rumble of helicopters to surveil communities. And so what is that transition from the more explicit, obvious that you can point out, right, to the much more embedded? And so this is where organizations like Stop LAPD Spying come in, where they're thinking about the more invisible forms of surveillance that nevertheless harm communities, but we need more we need to highlight it more. And so that's what the text is trying to do. Should we?
So, well, I thought we could finish by talking about some organizations who are doing good work in this vein. Because I like to uplift some of the organizations and individuals out there who are doing really amazing work in destroying the new Jim Code. So the first one I would offer is Data for Black Lives, which is a policy group, and they have a really great conference every year. Yoshima Bent Milner is just an absolute powerhouse, and they're also doing really interesting work on nutrition labeling for algorithms so that we can better understand how algorithms are functioning and what kinds of impacts they might have on our lives. What are some of the groups
Yeah,
you would,
there's
you
a
would
whole.
call
I
out?
have a whole list on the resources page on my website. But one of the sort of heartening developments I feel like over the last couple of years is the growing movement from within the tech industry. So tech won't build it, more than code, and so we begin to break down these binaries between outsiders and insiders. And one of the things that I attribute that movement to, I said those people must have taken a good sociology class when they were in college. But,
Absolutely.
but it just feels like there's a growing awareness from those who are producing it about their responsibility to the greater good. We can't rely only on that, because one of the questions I have as that movement has grown up around opposing ICE, opposing various kind of military contracts, is the lack of movement when it comes to the vast carceral net around Black and Latinx communities before this particular iteration. So the use of surveillance technologies going back, and so we can't just wait for tech insiders to grow a conscience. But I'm happy that movement is developing. And so for more, there's a lot of organizations and various movements that I list on the resources page for you to check.
Very important list, and very comprehensive list as well. I checked that out the other day, and I thought, wow, Ruha really nailed all of the important voices.
And I'm
of this
sure I'm missing
conversation.
lots, so just send me a note and I'll add more. So
Excellent. And your website is
ruhabenjamin.com.
ruhabenjamin.com. Resources. Okay. So thank you all. We have time for a few questions. We have about 10 minutes left in our time. It looks like we've got a question up there in the back.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm working with an inner ear thing, so again, bear with me. So my question is, and this has been a great day, definitely chock full of information. So I want to start with this idea of exceptionalism and subjectivity. So Ruha, you talked about, how you went into the field because science and technology was kind of lumped together with this idea of exceptionalism. And in working in diversity and issues of race in academia, there's always this feeling like you have to explain, or that it's kind of marginalized because you're talking about yourself and it's seen as subjective. So I'm getting to a point about that idea of the role of reverse. So I had a colleague, and I have to tell the story because I have to situate myself to help get this point through. So I was a chair of a search committee, and the bottom line is the Black candidate was just as qualified as the white candidate and the Asian American candidate who withdrew. But my point is, as a chair of the search committee, I found that my colleagues did not see the way that race was operating in the room. And yet, so we're in a field of library and information science studies. And so one of my colleagues, who I have a personal relationship, so he came up to me and he said, can I be honest with you? I don't feel comfortable talking about race. And so, that's one of the reasons, So anyway, I said, in thinking about this idea of exceptionalism, how is it that, if you use reverse logic, how is it that, white men are able to kind of come into this tech sphere and be able to be given all this prestige when they haven't done the work of unpacking their own biases and things like that, and they're just given this, carte blanche, prestige that they're doing this objective, neutral work. And so one of the things you said about we tend to default to math as the criteria for the search. We had done the strengths and weaknesses, and he came back later after we'd done all the work and said, I came up with this chart, and I put it together, I put the candidates on a chart, and this really helped me make my decision. His decision had already been made, but that was the logic that was like, this chart is going to really help us all make this decision. But in reality, the preferences and the biases were already made for the candidate everybody else wanted. But so saying that to say, if we use reverse logic, I guess, we would be able to say to a white person, you have to do your own homework about who you are and what you're, we would never necessarily say that. In order to do tech, you have to question your white privilege and see how you got to this point to create Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, to have this, year off of college, this gap year, to do this work, or, kind of question your own privilege. So anyway.
So it's a good example because it's an example of an algorithm that has biases and values embedded in it. And so maybe a Derek Bell approach would be for you to come in and be like, well, I did my own chart, And this is what I came up with. And in that way, show how your prior assumptions about who was the good candidate shaped what you valued, what weighted more or not. And that would be a way to reflect back at them. I'm not saying that you should have done that, but I'm just saying in this scenario, rather than just say your thing is biased, to actually perform it by showing how I can create a whole different algorithm. So my candidate will come out on top because of the characteristics that I value and how I weighted it. And so this is just a thought process, but searches are fraught, and so we can talk about that after. Yeah.
I think maybe it would be pretty fun if we provoked people by saying, hey, you need to examine your white privilege before you build technology. One thing I would also recommend in terms of vocabulary for these kinds of conversations is a book called Damned Lies and Statistics. And there's a sequel called More Damned Lies and Statistics. So a lot of the rhetoric around, oh, we're using these supposedly neutral statistical frameworks or statistics or frameworks or what have you, is the language of calculation, which is a kind of distancing, as you said. And so if you learn the lingo, then you can offer the same lingo as a counter, right? So if you are familiar with the availability heuristic, you can throw that out in these conversations, and I don't know. It's a useful way to counter the distancing.
And I will just say on that, I am all for sort of empowering people with the language and the tools that you are, the terrain on which you're fighting. But I also think that there's often a call for people to gain this technological literacy and not the corollary. That is, for people to gain a basic level of social and racial literacy before they can do X, Y, and Z. And so part of, I think, the challenge is not simply to become better at playing the game as it's been set up, but to question, why is it that I have to develop this language and these tools, and you get to be ignorant on X, Y, and Z, and still call yourself an expert? Right? And so I think there needs to be a related demand for people to develop a basic sense of racial and social literacy before they start getting their hands dirty, developing things that are going to create all kinds of havoc in people's lives because of their handiwork.
Absolutely. And do you feel like computer science education has enough sociological literacy embedded in it?
What's the emoji for this? No, I think that there's some programs that are better than others. There's a growing sort of demand for it, a sort of infusing ethics, but it goes back to a point that you made earlier in terms of the way that ethics is operationalized. I am ambivalent based on my understanding of how bioethics as a field has grown up as a kind of handmaiden to biomedicine rather than a challenge to a real kind of a site of questioning and critical engagement, and rather a field that often clears the way and makes consent possible without really empowering communities for informed refusal. And so just thinking about the way that other ethical fields have developed in conjunction with a STEM field, I think we have reason to be wary about a kind of roboethics or technoethics that is being developed solely to enable technology without allowing communities and people to have a critical say in refusing certain types of technologies, such as facial recognition and others.
Alondra Nelson says that we need to open up a space to say no to technology, which I think is really important. And to your point about ethics, when we think about ethics and the historical, just intellectual tradition of ethics, we have to think about which field does it come from. It comes from the field of philosophy, right? Philosophers own the domain of ethics. And then we have to look at philosophers and think about who are the people in the field of philosophy.
It's more homogenous than STEM fields.
Exactly. So I think we really need to open up the conversation to the social sciences and the humanities as well. It needs to be a truly interdisciplinary conversation, and we need to do less policing of boundaries. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Right over there.
Thank you both so much for what you offered us today. I really appreciated it, and I hope it's given me at least a lot to think about going forward. Thinking about the futurity of the intersections of science and race, I began to think about two things. Toni Morrison's statement of how the very serious function of racism is distraction, but I'm also thinking of Dorothy Roberts' consideration of biosocial plasticity, how every time we take a step forward of these intersections, that gives way to new ways of excuses for biological and scientific determinism. So my question is, how do we confront these issues, anticipate them as well, but not reduce ourselves to always being in and around these problems? Or how do we, or not reduce our livelihoods and research to always being in and around these problems?
That's a great $1 million question. Do you have an immediate thought around it? I have some thoughts around it. I mean, so I have a set of responses to the Toni Morrison part and the Dorothy Roberts part of it. I mean, one of the things that I've sort of come to over the last 2 years, prompting by some senior scholars, is, so I'll give you a very concrete example. To the first Toni Morrison point. I finished this edited volume, and we were trying to think about the title for it, and the title was all like, technology oppression, it was like coming out hard, with the critical analysis. And one of the senior contributors to that volume was like, you're ceding all of the intellectual terrain, the framing to the problem. And you're not giving any space to your own imagination of what the good life is, what the alternative is, what world you want to live in. And so the challenge to me through that exchange was, in the simple naming of something, how we often give over everything to the response, however important, without giving intellectual space to the world that we want, naming it, claiming it, having a word for it. And so that's partly why, and I went back and retitled it, thinking about what is liberatory imagination or emancipatory imagination in everyday life. Because if we don't start to reclaim some of that intellectual space, I do agree that the imagination of an elite few that gets infused into so much of this shows us the power of imagination, the kind of perversion of imagination as an sort of oppressive force. But imagination is also something that we have to reclaim as ours. So how do we want to materialize our own imagination of what the good life is, what a just society is? And so I think in part that is a response to Toni Morrison. I've heard her talk over the last few years about, just even in our writing, writing more about what is joy, like what is happiness, like having stories about that in addition to the stories of the pain and the violence and the hardship, So it's finding that balance. And I have some other thoughts around the elasticity, the kind of Dorothy Roberts point, which I think is important, and it just pushes us to really understand the limitation of the facts or the data around something, around even our project of being teachers. What is data good for, but what isn't it good for? And I'll leave you with this last reflection, and that has to do with some colleagues who out at Stanford who wrote a great set of papers about how things like just presenting people with data about racial disparities in the criminal justice system actually doesn't lead them to want to support reforms in the system, right? Specifically white Americans. So they do a study based in the Bay Area and New York showing data about the disparities and then asking white Americans, the respondents, okay, so now are you willing to support reforms against three strikes law, against stop and frisk? And the more they were exposed to the knowledge around this, the less likely they were to support the reforms, which tells us that something is happening between their eyes and the data, and that is all of the stories, the narratives, the interpretive frames that say, oh, if there's more black people behind bars, they must deserve to be there, right? They must be more criminal. It confirms all of that, the racial narratives. And so that tells us that we have to be as rigorous around the narratives and the stories and challenging that as a terrain of struggle as we are about producing better data, because the data is not going to save us, you know? And so again, it's thinking about where we invest our energies. And it's also just a challenge to this idea that, you know, more facts and data about inequality, it has a kind of perverse quality. You know, like, who are we trying to convince? They're already not invested in our humanity. So why are we expending our entire intellectual energy trying to produce more of this stuff that's not making a dent, right? So I think we have to really examine what we think shifts society, where we think social change comes from, and pour more of our energies into those life-affirming projects rather than simply responding to what is.
Well put.
Thank you.
And I think that is a wonderful note to end on. So we can all feel inspired and leave the day with your voice ringing in our ears. Ruha Benjamin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Meredith Broussard.
Thank you all.
Thank you both, and please buy both of their books. Buy 2 copies if you need to or more. I want to finish out the day with a poll of sorts, because I was told someone in the room posted something on Twitter that I want to confirm by your voting. How many of you have been to a technology-related conference where all of the speakers were people of color? Before today. And the same where all of those speakers, or I should say the majority of those speakers were women? All right. Okay. All right. Well, this is, of course, part of the premise of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, which is to say, what if the conversations that we had today were at the center of our understanding, our development, how we think about public policy and the public interest of technology? What if these questions, concerns about racial group interest and dynamics and economics and joy and all of these prerogatives were the lens through which we made our decisions about how technology would inform and determine, in some respect, our future? And so that is the promise of this group. And to finish out the evening, which we'll do upstairs with a reception that I hope that you'll be able to join us for, we will give you an opportunity to continue to engage with this work, with the production of what we've called the CRDS syllabus. And Rachel Kuo and Lori Quito Lopez are going to say more about that during the reception. But for now, thank you. Thanks for all of you who watched on C-SPAN or through the live stream. Thanks for all of you who came out to join us today. Thanks for all the CRDS affiliates who put together this programs and lent us your brilliant minds and ideas. Thank you, and let's go have a drink.